Our story today on Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains is about the Apache Strongholds in the wilderness area proper. I would recommend that you go back and review our Apache Wars program, which will have a lot of information I won't be able to cover here today. One of the first things I want to clear up, though, is that the Apaches were not indigenous to Arizona. The archaeologists say that they were originally from southwestern Canada and parts of Alaska, and they came into the United States proper and worked their way down into the plains where the Comanches drove them out. And they ended up in Mexico and some in the mountains of New Mexico, and eventually came into Arizona around the 1300s. They established communities in the Superstition Mountains from which they raided everybody. There was nobody they left alone. In fact, the Apaches were pretty well subdued by the military until the start of the Civil War. When the Civil War broke out, many forts in Arizona and New Mexico were totally abandoned, and others just had skeleton crews, and the Apaches went crazy. They thought they had driven the white man from their territory, and there was no stopping them. In fact, there was something like 300 murders between 1864 and 1870 in Yavapai County alone, where Prescott was the territorial capital. Fort McDowell was established in 1864 to deal with the problem. And the soldiers were not U.S. military soldiers. They were militia units that had been formed with the Pima and the Maricopa and some Papago Indians to protect themselves against the Apaches, who were raiding them constantly. In fact, the population of Arizona had very few white people in it. The first white child was born in Phoenix in 1875, and we're talking well before 1875. So it was largely the existing indigenous Arizona Indians, the Maricopa, the Papago, the Pima, and a lot of Mexicans were living here. And that was what the first militia units were formed of. And the Maricopa and the Pima were the ones that went up and done the first adobe work on the first buildings at Fort Apache. And they were the ones that done all the fighting, tracking of Apaches until 1871. There were two periods of Indian history in Arizona. One was the rancheria period before 1871, and the other was the renegade period after 1871. Some historians will vary a year or two on those dates, but I picked 1871 because that's when the Fort Grant massacre took place. At the massacre of Fort Grant in 1871, there were approximately 100 Papago Indians, 40 Mexicans, and 6 white men that took reprisals on a group of Apaches that had been raiding in the area. The problem was they didn't realize that the Apaches had already surrendered and were under the protection of the Army. Well, President Grant called this murder, and he wanted the civilians and the Indians to be brought under control. So he replaced Stoneman with General Crook. Now, Crook no longer would use Papagos and Pimas and Maricopas as scouts and soldiers, so he started using Apaches against Apaches, and this was quite successful as well. So back to the Rancheria area, period of time, the Pimas and Maricopas made up the entire military force except for the leaders. And the chiefs of the tribes were put in and made sergeants over all the rest of them, so that there wasn't any communications problems. But it was the Pima and the Maricopa mostly that went out and tracked down the Apaches in the wilderness area where their camps were, which were semi-permanent camps until at least they were discovered. But there were many battles in the Superstition proper that we've never talked about. And I'm going to show you where some of these locations were. Our first location was at Hackberry Springs, which was formerly known as Frog Tanks. There was two ways to get to Hackberry Springs, and one of them you would be easily recognized by the guards that were at the Apache camp. So they would usually take the long way around or a different route to sneak up on them. Mostly they done it at night, and by dawn they were ready to make their attack. A large encampment of Apaches was at Garden Valley. Garden Valley is on the edge of the Superstitions. It's in the wilderness, but before you get into real canyons or mountains, Garden Valley was a major location of the Hohokam in years before. Then there was a couple of battles at Pinyon Camp, which is located where Weaver's Needle is. And you can begin to realize that many different canyons would have to be accessed to get to these places. Another one, which I've never been to, is Hell's Hole. I've never been able to locate that properly. It's approximately where it shows on the map here. And then there were several battles over in the eastern edge of the western part of the wilderness. One was at Indian Springs on the way to Dismal Valley. Dismal Valley was a major encampment of Apaches, and a lot of Apaches met their end at Dismal Valley. Dismal Valley is where Tortilla Ranch was located. Many people will recognize that place. Then at Fish Creek Canyon was two battles. One was called Quell Springs, and that was a pretty large settlement of Apaches at that point. Then, of course, off the map here is Revis Ranch, where it was a major Apache stronghold. And a couple of battles took place at Revis Ranch. And then as you left the wilderness, on the very eastern edge of the wilderness was Tonto Basin. And this was a really major settlement of Apaches, and a lot of great battles took place in that area. So that's our story of Apache strongholds in the Superstition Mountains.
Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.